Thank you. Today I'm going to talk about some really strange weapons that were developed during World War II, both by the Allies and by the Axis powers. They were pretty unusual, very creative. The ones by the Axis particularly were developed, most of them later in the war when things were getting pretty desperate, and they were desperate moves. Most of these you probably won't have heard of before. They're that unusual. Normally speaking, this is a 2-hour talk, which I've crunched down, so some of the weapons have got lost on the cutting room floor. But I think the ones that remain will be, you'll enjoy them. Some of the film clips I have in here are more than 70 years old now, so they're a little bit rusty. But I think they will illustrate the concepts involved well enough. And by the way, the British love to name their projects like this after Old Testament and old ideas, old poems. And this is another one, the Great Panjandrum. What the heck is a panjandrum? Well, it was a rocket-powered assault device. And the idea, this was closer toward the time when the Normandy invasion was looming. And they wanted something to try to deal with these great structures that the Germans had built on the coast of Normandy. And the idea here was this thing, which was just a big wheel with rockets around the side. They'd launch that from an LST, getting close to the shore, and it would kind of roll its way up and smash into the fortifications and explode them. Great idea. This is showing some of the fortifications that they felt they were going to have to deal with. And here's this guy. This was from a reconnaissance aircraft zoom over one of the beaches, and here's this guy running for his life. But these were some of the huge structures that the Germans had built. This is what really had them worried. They had some field trials. So the original ones were 10 feet in diameter, held 2,000 pounds of explosives, and 70 rockets around the periphery. And here's one. You might ask the question, how is this thing being steered? They had a rope on either side of it and a guy like this, back on the ship, trying to steer it, which was a big problem in its own right. Here it is coming on shore. The photographer is sort of heading straight for the photographer. You're the photographer. And this thing is heading right towards you. Ah, get out of the way. Boom. So it's a little bit chancy for the sweating bullets there, but in any case, that didn't work so well. So, well, maybe we add a third wheel. We tried that for a while. That didn't work well either. So eventually, that's the third wheel one. You see what happened to that. They just gave it up because essentially it was impossible to control. You couldn't really steer it. You set it and forget it and hope it would go in the right direction. But it just didn't work. And there was some serious discussion in the 1970s that the whole project was just intended as a diversion, because these tests were conducted on a beach in southern England that was a resort. So there was no secrecy at all. And the idea was they did it that way on purpose to kind of divert the Germans and think they were going to really use this as a weapon. So it's unknown, but that's one of the suspicions. This is one of my favorites. Bruno, how would you pronounce that? Hookdruckpumpe. Okay.
Yeah, high pressure pump.
High pressure pump. Exactly. Now, imagine you have a big gun, like, let me find one of these, a railroad cannon. This is typical of what was used in World War II and in World War I. Let's say you want to throw a shell, a couple of 1,000-pound shell, 30, 40 miles. You make a big cannon. The longer the better, to get you more push behind the shell. But you have to make the gun very thick at the tail end, because the pressure there is going to be the greatest. Well, what Germany wanted to do is to go more than 80 miles to London. They wanted to be able to attack London from the ground, from a cannon of some kind. London is 80 miles or a little bit more from the closest point of approach in France. So the typical kind of gun just wouldn't cut the mustard, it would explode. And so they came up with this idea for a sectional gun. So it would have a modest barrel at the end. Here's the shell with a modestly thick barrel at the end. And then what would happen? You'd start off with a charge. You'd explode a charge right at the very left end and just behind the shell, and that would get things started. And then what would happen is a little bit later on, after maybe 5 or 10 feet, there'd be another charge or set of charges that would give a boost. And then there'd be another set of charges a little bit farther on to give another boost. So they had 5 or so boosts. And then the idea would be, then you wouldn't need to have as thick and as complex a gun. You get something with much less thickness in it, particularly towards the rear end. Have a high velocity, 5,000 feet per second, which is a huge velocity and great range. Well, great idea, but the problem is, and this is an example of the aftermath of a failed test, it didn't work as well as they wanted to, not only because you'd still have high pressures and the thing would still explode, but also it was very hard to get the timing right of these explosions going along the way. The electronics just weren't up to the mustard at the time. They couldn't cope. Oops. Here's what the round is. This is the shell that they used. It was very small, only weighed 300 pounds. So you can imagine you'd have to fire an awful lot of these shells in order to have an effective weapon. Even though it could go 95 miles, which actually had a test, and one of them actually went that distance, going extremely fast, so when it hit the ground it would make a big hole, but it was only a 300-pound projectile, so it couldn't make that big a hole. It could cause some damage for sure, but you have to fire like one of those a minute in order to really make an effective weapon in terms of the number of people killed or the facilities damaged. It was overrun. They had built this huge facility in a place called Mamayak, where they had 5 or 6 of these guns under construction by slave laborers, and the British found out about it, and it was bombed into oblivion. Unfortunately, they collapsed the roof of this hidden thing was being built in a cave, and there were several thousand slave laborers who were drowned in this. Everything on the actually the Bundesarchiv, which is the Germans' photo archive, has a lot of this material, including the videos, which were 8mm and 60mm film. The British Archive in London has a lot as well. I've had someone go through and take photographs and all that for all this material. So it's all legitimate. None of it is currently classified. It's all public domain now.
But it was.
Oh, highly classified then. Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep.